Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything, and I am coming back at you with another Wargaming in Miniature video. We are going to be talking about black powder and our boot camp. We had a boot camp a number of years back where I discussed the rules in black powder, and I neglected to go over a couple of different topics. And so these two videos, this being part 2 of this new series, is to go over topics that I either didn't go over or stated that I'd go over in a later video. So in this video, what we're going to be talking about is size of units, basing of those sized units to accomplish the formations that those units are allowed to be in, and how it might be done differently based on personal preferences. I am specifically focusing on 1815 100 Days campaign, Allies and French. All right, so let's talk about standard sized units. Okay, so you can kind of see standard sized units are 24 figure units. And these are 24 figure units. All of these here are 24 figure units. And let's get a standard size cavalry unit as well. A standard size cavalry unit will be 12 figures. Also 6 bases. So there's 6 bases here, and there are 6 bases here. It's just that these only have 2 figures per base because of the horse, and these have the 4 figures per base. 24 figures or 12 figures. And if you're an artillery piece, a standard, a small, a large, a half battery, a full battery, doesn't matter. It's 1 gun and crew. The number of crew is irrelevant, but 4 is the understood number of figures. If you wanted, this is just personal preference, if you wanted to represent a half battery, you might put only 3 crew on the base. If you wanted to represent a grand battery or like a few extra guns, instead of just 8 guns, if you wanted to represent maybe 12 guns, you might put an extra figure or 2 on the base or make the base a little bit bigger. There are people out there that will take 2 cannon models and say that that is a battery, and then 1 cannon model would be half battery. That seems reasonable, but that's also not accurate. Okay, so this being the standard size, there's a couple of things. Let's talk about infantry first, and I'll get to cavalry in just a minute. So in the infantry, in the British, in the French, you can form attack column like this, or a 4-rank line, which they look exactly the same. But because they cannot form attack column and they cannot form 4-rank line, you just have to know that based on their nationality, what that formation represents. So because they're French, that has to be an attack column. And because they're British / Hanover, that has to be a 4-rank line. Now, because these cannot deploy skirmishers, I did not need to mount any figures in a skirmish style base, in my opinion. 90% of my units, which is 90% of my armies, almost all my armies, have this ability to put 1/3 of their units in front as skirmishers, as a mixed formation. So what I do is I take my elite companies and I magnetize them, and I put them on 40 by 40 magnets, and then when I go to deploy them, I take them off the magnets, and these are all on 2-figure bases. So then I've got my skirmishers out here without having individual figures to fiddle around with and worry about. And then I can just put these off to the side somewhere and put them back out when these guys redeploy back into their formation. Now, because these guys can form attack column and mixed, or they can form line and mixed, there you go. I've got my 4 bases. I've got my skirmishers, which is 1/3 of the models. Good to go. That's a good way to form it. Now, with this battalion over here, I did it a little bit differently. I took 1/3 of the models, but I based them individually and magnetized them, so I can, which is both perfectly legal or acceptable ways to do it. And there you go. I got my skirmishers out in front, and then I would just take my magnetized bases and put them off to the side somewhere. But because, and these guys would all have to be in the front, and they're all supposed to be within 2 inches of the front of your unit, but that's neither here nor there. So you could do it either way. You can go individual, which definitely looks like skirmishers. That's pretty much a guarantee that that looks like skirmishers. And that also kind of looks like skirmishers in my opinion. It just makes it easier to move them. And also when they're attached to their magnet, it makes it easier for me to move that base as one base. Remember, these guys cannot form skirmishers. If, for whatever reason, you have a unit that is all 6 bases, or the 4-figure bases, you can still form skirmish. You would just have to take a couple of bases, put them out front, separate them, and say they're the skirmishers. Okay, so now we were talking about size of units, and the way the rules kind of portray size of units is standard is 24, and then small is the next size below that, and that is exactly half of your standard size units. So you're looking at 12 figures. There is a small unit. Instead of mounting them all on 3 4x4s, which you could definitely do, and then they would be able to form a line, but I also wanted to form a, what do they call it, a 4-rank line. And if I did this, that is 4 ranks, but it's not fully wide like it's supposed to be. So what I do is I broke this base up and I deploy it like that. Now, if you need to do a march column, I can do a march column. If I want to do a column of companies, maybe one of these back there, take one of these bases off, or I could take these 2 off and say that that's a column of companies. So basically, even though you see that these are split as well, there's no real need for them to be split. I take one figure. There you go. And remember, they cannot form an attack column, which has to be wider than it is deep, which it is, 4 by 3. That could be an attack column, but because they are British, they cannot form an attack column. They can only form 4-rank line, but this is just represented by 3 ranks, but we understand. Being that they're such a small unit, I probably would never do that anyway. I would just go ahead and form an actual full-fledged line and get the better benefit of the fire value. And if I need to form mixed, I would just drop a couple of these bases out front as skirmishers. Boom. There is a small unit deployed and how I would break down the bases. Now let's talk about a small cavalry unit. Remember, cavalry is 12 figures, so a small cavalry unit would be exactly half, or 6 models. And there you go. You got, now what I did was I put a couple of these individually just so that I could, redeploy them however I wanted. Like there would be your march column, It's deeper than it is wide. They can't form. Cavalry doesn't form attack columns. They form either deep formation, regular line, and so this is line. This is also line. So that's a small cavalry unit. Now, working our way down, we're going to talk about a tiny unit, right? And they do exist. So if this is 12 figures, I can't take 6 models like this and say that's a tiny unit, because that's not the way black powder does it. The way black powder does it is tiny units are always skirmish. And so you take 6 of these models. There you go. There's your tiny unit. They don't ever form up. They always stay in skirmish. So what you could do is mount them on round bases. That's what I've seen, to prevent people from trying to form them up. But you can put them on like washers or something a little heavier. These guys are on square 20 millimeter squares. They're plastic, so they're not top heavy. But if they're metal, you might consider putting them on slightly larger washers. I considered like 25 millimeter washers, but I'm staying with the 20 millimeter squares. Even on my tiny units that are dedicated tiny, I'm still going to put them on 20 millimeter squares. Cavalry that are tiny would be like 3 models, and they would be also skirmish. You don't see a lot of skirmish cavalry, but and there's very few tiny cavalry units out there, but that's the way it would be done. Okay, so we got tiny, we got small, we got standard or medium, I guess you could call it, but it's called standard. And then there's large. A large unit, I've got a large infantry unit right here. Okay, this is 6 bases, remember, is your standard unit. What I did was just add 2 more bases. Makes it 8 bases, and it's large. You could just tell that's large. When you're in the British, when they're in their 4-rank line, there you go, right? And then they can also deploy skirmishers. Now, because this is kind of an odd number, I considered making 3 bases skirmishers, but I figured that would have, so like hypothetically, let's say I made this base skirmishers as well, that would have made this block an odd number. And so what I did was I left that, because once you deploy skirmishers, you really can't tell. So I just did 2 bases as skirmishers and left the rest on full bases. And that's the way I do large units. Let's talk about large cavalry. Well, let's talk about my cavalry in general. Okay, because this is not how I normally do cavalry. It's just that was a small unit. So let's... A standard size cavalry unit normally, for me, is done like this. 3 figures on a base that's 1.5 times the width. There we go. So I can form line. I can form, again, line, right? I'm good on a line. I'm good on a 2-rank line, which you can do. 2 deep line, which cavalry can do. Or I can do march column. which is 3 wide and 4 deep. So that's longer than it is wide. Perfect march column. And it's still 12 figures. All right, now when I'm going into my large cavalry, I'm still mounting my cavalry 3 figures wide. Bear with me, these are all metal and so they weigh a ton. I basically, like my infantry, I just added 2 bases, which is really a little bit more than 2 bases. But basically that puts it at 18, which is the prescribed size for a large unit. And then if I need to do march column, I can still do that. If I need to do a single line, I still can do that. And it makes this unit easier to move around because I have less bases. Now, if I was to mount them on 2-figure bases like a normal unit, I would also just add 2 additional bases. So it would be a lot like my infantry. It would go from 6 to 8. But since I prefer to mount them on 3 figures per base, I just went ahead and went with the full 18. If I ever needed to treat this as a standard size unit, I could always just remove 2 bases and say that's standard, and then I could actually say that's a small unit, right? 6 figures. But at Quatre Bras, Brunswick Hussars was a large unit, so there you have it. And then when it comes to artillery, artillery is 1 figure with crew. No matter if it's tiny, small, large, or standard, it doesn't matter. It's always 1 cannon with crew. The crew, you can mount them individually like skirmishers and then just have your gun model sitting on the table. So you could have a gun model sitting on the table and you would just, put your crew around the cannon. And that is also a perfectly legit way to play with artillery, and you would just measure from the barrel. In the case of a figure with a base, I measure from the center of the base. Now, something I've considered personally, that if I wanted to have like a small unit, like a half battery, I would maybe just use a couple of crew members, or maybe 3 crew members, and say that's a half battery. And then if I wanted to say it was a tiny unit, I don't know, like just a couple of guns, then maybe I would say just use a couple of crew members and say that's a tiny unit. And then if I was wanting to say it's an extra large battery, maybe I would add a figure or 2 into my crew, and that tells me that it's a large battery. Not some of these gamers out there that mount 2 guns and they put them side by side and they say that's a standard battery. I disagree with that. That's not what the rules say. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. In the rule books, it explains the width of the unit is the only thing that's important, not the number of figures or however many bases you put them on, because you can mount an entire battalion individually, or you could put them all on just a couple of bases or something. But the standard understanding is 20 millimeter frontage, 2 figures per base, making that a 40 millimeter frontage. And then whenever you buy a unit from Warlord Games, the maker of black powder, they have included bases that are 40 millimeters or 50 millimeters for cavalry. So I just believe in sticking to the prescribed method. 24 figures is what you would normally get in a box if you buy it. So I stick with that prescribed 24. Plus, in the first edition rules, it does say 24 is a standard size unit. It also says that a 12 would be a small unit and 6 is a tiny unit. So we're going with that. Alright guys, well thanks for coming out and checking out the second half of this video. That was a lot shorter than the first video. And I will see you in the next one.